Hello. Today's story is called The Bird Child. A certain small girl once lived in a big city which had a forest on its northern edge and an orphanage on its southern edge. The little girl was an orphan herself. She had no father and no mother, only an aunt. But this aunt was of the forgetful kind, and one day when they were having a picnic in the forest, the aunt forgot she had a little girl to look after, and she wandered off home, packed her suitcase and went to South America. She was never heard of again. The little girl waited and waited for her to come back. Fortunately, the aunt had left her under a wild apple tree, and she lay on her back watching the pattern of blue skies, green leaves and red apples. When the apples fell, she ate them. On the third day of waiting, 2 pigeons flew down and looked at the little girl very hard. "Are you going to live here forever?" they asked. But the little girl was too small to explain that she'd been left there by her auntie. "My dear," said the father pigeon to the mother pigeon, "I think she's been left behind by some picnickers. They're always leaving eggshells and banana peels around. Now they've left a small child." "It's very untidy of them," said the mother pigeon. "Poor little girl. Shall we adopt her?" Now in this forest lived all different kinds of birds in the world, and the pigeons called them all together, and they began to make a special nest for the little girl. First of all, they wove tree twigs together to make a floor and walls, and then the thrushes and blackbirds lined it with straw and mud to keep out the wind and rain, and then the sparrows, finches and warblers lined it with moss and feathers for softness. Working together, some of the strongest birds lifted the little girl into the nest, and they brought her blackberries and grass seeds to eat, and even a few worms. She just opened her mouth and they poked food into it. It was much easier than living with the aunt, who used to say, "Sit up straight and don't make a lot of crumbs when you eat." As the weeks went by, the birds grew very fond of the little girl and were always trying to think of ways to amuse her. Because she hated to see them fly away and leave her, they made her a pair of wings out of twigs and tree gum and feathers. The little girl soon learnt how to use them very cleverly. She flew with the birds in the sunshine, and she soared and twisted in and out of the forest trees, chasing the birds and gathering her own blackberries and worms. Living like this, she grew strong and brown and wild. Her hair was all tangly and full of leaves and flowers. Her clothes got torn to pieces and fell off, but this made it much simpler when she wanted to go for a swim. Every few months the birds made her a new pair of wings, brighter and stronger than those he had outgrown. One day, a hunter hunting around saw a flash of blue in the green trees. Flying on wings made of peacocks and kingfishers, the little girl span into sight for a moment and then was lost again. The huntsman didn't know that the birds had made wings for her. He thought she'd grown them all on her own. He went back and he bought another hunter and a circus man, and they set up a table in the middle of the forest with a birthday cake on it. And before long the bird child came down to look at it, and the hunters threw a net over her. Her great wings broke and they crumpled. The hunters and the circus man were very angry when they found her wings were just tied on with ribbons woven of grass, but there was nothing they could do about it, so they took the little girl out of the forest right across the city to the orphanage. It was a square brown building in the square brown yard, and the woman in charge was Mrs. Parsley. She didn't enjoy her job very much. She really wanted to spend her time growing tomatoes and strawberries. Instead, she had to look after 30 lively, grubby children, and when the hunters gave her the bird child, she was not pleased. She went with her tongue and took the bird child inside, and she scrubbed her and rubbed her, but she couldn't make her pale like the other orphans. She couldn't brush her tangly hair either, so she snipped it all off. She dressed the bird child in a brown dress and put shoes on her feet so she couldn't run. And the walls around the orphanage were as tall as the trees were, and there was a lock on the gate. The little bird child grew thinner and quieter, and she became paler than any of the other orphans. Mrs. Parsley gave her cod liver oil, but even that didn't make her better. Mrs. Parsley could have given her a beakful of honey or a few worms, but Mrs. Parsley didn't think about that. Once a week, the mayor of the city used to come and count the orphans. He was very proud of his neat, well-run orphanage. "Now, where did this new orphan come from?" said the mayor. "She doesn't look as be a very good one." "Some hunters found her in the forest," said Mrs. Parsley. "You never know where orphans are going to turn up these days." Just then the mayor and Mrs. Parsley heard a noise like the wind. But there wasn't any wind, and they looked up at the hills on the other side of the city, and they saw a cloud rise from the secret heart of the forest. It swirled and eddied like smoke, but it wasn't smoke. It shimmered and shivered like silk, but it wasn't silk. Mrs. Parsley and the mayor stared uneasily, and the cloud came closer and closer. "It's birds," said Mrs. Parsley, amazed. "Birds!" cried the mayor like an echo. "Sparrows and thrushes and blackbirds and peacocks and pigeons and parrots and pelicans and firebirds and pheasants and flamingos and swans and seagulls, egrets and eagles, herons and hummingbirds and various finches. All were flying straight towards the orphanage, making the air whisper and the leaves stir and rustle with the wind of their wings." "Well, "I've never seen so many birds," said Mrs. Parsley suspiciously. "It's not natural. They've dropped feathers all round the orphanage, and it's just been rolled and swept." Down in the orphanage yard, one orphan looked up at the birds and cried up to them in a voice that was curious and lonely. She held her arms out as if she might fly up and join them. And the cloud of birds wheeled and swept down, making a great storm. For a moment, the Mayor and Mrs. Parsley could see nothing but bright, whirling feathers. And then the birds rose again and flew off towards the forest. They took all of the orphans with them. Mrs. Parsley and the Mayor stared after them. "Those birds, they've taken the civic orphans," said the Mayor, "and they haven't filled out any adoption forms." The birds flew back to the forest. They'd come to the orphanage looking for their bird child, but because they couldn't tell one orphan from another, they'd taken the lot. They carried all the orphans into the green shade of the forest and began looking after them. First they built them nests, and then they fed them with honey. And the orphans sat in a row, and the birds dropped honey into their mouths. And then the birds made the orphan wings, and all the orphans became bird children. Mrs. Parsley spent the spring with a spade digging up the orphanage lawn, and she grew the most remarkable tomatoes. On summer evenings, she would look up from her bright garden to see the bird children tossing like kites all over the green roof of the forest, their wings wide and shining, carrying them up towards the stars. That's the end of the story. Would you like to be a bird child and fly high? I think I'd be too scared. Night, night. God bless.